Pacific Ocean holds a scale that is difficult to measure in human terms. It stretches beyond visible limits, a continuous surface shaped by wind, currents, and time. From above, it appears uniform. From within, it is variable, shifting between calm expanses and sudden instability. For long distances, there is no land, no fixed reference point, and no interruption to its horizon. Along the coast of Chiapas, where the land meets this expanse, small fishing communities operate on routines shaped by the ocean's patterns. Boats leave before dawn. They follow routes known through repetition rather than formal mapping. The return is expected within a predictable window, often by the next day, depending on weather and catch. On most days, the conditions remain manageable. The surface rises and falls in steady intervals. Wind direction is noted, but rarely feared. Experience allows fishermen to read the water in ways that are not formally recorded. Decisions are made quickly and without ceremony, but distance accumulates quietly in the open ocean. A boat can move farther from shore than intended, without any clear marker of that change. The horizon does not shift to signal warning. There is no visible boundary between near and far. It is within this environment that small miscalculations become difficult to reverse. A change in weather, a mechanical failure, or a missed bearing can remove the possibility of return. Once that happens, the ocean does not provide correction. It only continues. In November 2012, along the Pacific coast near Costa Azul, small-scale fishing remained a primary source of income for many local residents. The work was informal, often arranged day by day, depending on weather, equipment availability, and immediate need. Boats were modest fiberglass hulls fitted with outboard motors, designed for short trips rather than extended voyages. José Salvador Alvarenga was among those who worked these waters regularly. Born in El Salvador, he had spent years fishing along the Mexican coast. His experience was practical rather than technical. He understood currents, bait patterns, and the handling of small vessels. Like many others in the region, his work followed necessity rather than long-term planning. On or around November 17, he prepared for a fishing trip expected to last less than a day. The plan was routine: travel offshore, set lines for shark and other large fish, and return with the catch to sell locally. There was no indication that conditions would deviate significantly from normal patterns. Originally, the crew was expected to include multiple individuals. However, circumstances changed shortly before departure. One of the more experienced fishermen did not join the trip. In his place, a younger and less experienced man agreed to go. Ezequiel Cordoba had limited time at sea compared to Alvarenga. Reports suggest he was relatively new to offshore fishing and had not yet developed the same familiarity with long hours on open water. His role on the boat was supportive, assisting with equipment, handling lines, and helping manage the catch. The vessel itself was not equipped for long-distance navigation. It carried basic tools, fishing lines, hooks, a cooler for storing fish, and minimal emergency supplies. There was no enclosed cabin. Protection from weather was limited. Communication equipment, if present, was not designed for extended range signaling. The departure followed the usual pattern. The boat left the shoreline and moved outward into deeper water, guided by experience rather than instruments. Early conditions did not suggest instability. The sea was navigable, and the work proceeded as expected. Hours passed in routine activity. Lines were set and checked. The men focused on the immediate task of securing a viable catch. The coastline, though no longer visible, remained an assumed direction rather than a precise coordinate. Nothing in those early hours indicated that the journey would extend beyond its intended duration. The boat remained functional. The weather had not yet shifted in any significant way. The situation, at that point, was ordinary. But the conditions that define a safe return are often dependent on factors beyond immediate perception. Changes can develop at a distance before they become visible. By the time they reach a small vessel, there is often little room for adjustment. For Alvarenga and Cordoba, that change was already forming beyond the horizon. The change in weather did not arrive gradually. Reports from the region indicate that a system developed quickly over the Pacific, producing strong winds and heavy rainfall. For small fishing vessels operating far from shore, such systems can remove visibility and control within a short period of time. Alvarenga and Cordoba were already at a considerable distance from the coastline when conditions began to shift. The first signs would have been subtle: an increase in wind speed, irregular movement in the water, and a darkening of the sky. These indicators are familiar to experienced fishermen, but their significance depends on timing and distance from land. As the storm intensified, waves became less predictable. The boat, designed for nearshore use, was not built to handle sustained exposure to open ocean conditions of that scale. Rain reduced visibility. The horizon, which normally provides orientation, disappeared behind a uniform wall of gray. At some point during the storm, the vessel's outboard motor failed. Accounts suggest it became clogged or damaged, possibly due to debris or prolonged strain under rough conditions. Without propulsion, the boat lost its ability to maintain direction. Steering alone was not sufficient to counter the force of wind and current. Attempts to communicate distress were made using available equipment. However, the effectiveness of these efforts was limited by range and weather interference. Once contact was lost, there was no reliable way to signal position. The boat was no longer part of a monitored system. It became an untracked object moving with the ocean. Fishing gear, which had initially been deployed for the day's work, was cut loose or abandoned as conditions worsened. The priority shifted from catching fish to maintaining stability. Weight distribution on the vessel became critical. Any imbalance could increase the risk of capsizing. The storm continued for an extended period. Exact duration is difficult to confirm, but it lasted long enough to push the boat far from its intended route. Without a functioning engine or navigational reference, the direction of drift could not be determined with precision. When the storm eventually subsided, the environment did not return to its original state. The sky cleared, and the surface of the water stabilized, but the fundamental situation had changed. The coastline was no longer visible. There were no nearby vessels. No fixed landmarks remained. At that point, the possibility of immediate return had already passed. The boat was no longer traveling. It was drifting. When the storm passed, it left a surface that appeared manageable, but offered no direction. The sky cleared in intervals. The water settled into long, steady movements. There was no immediate threat of capsizing, but the absence of danger did not restore control. The boat drifted without propulsion. Its movement was determined by currents that could not be seen directly. The men had no navigational instruments capable of establishing position. The coastline remained out of sight. With no clear heading, decisions shifted from travel to maintenance. The first priority was water. The vessel carried no significant freshwater reserve. Any supply that had been on board was limited and not intended for extended use. Within a short period, dehydration became a central concern. Under open sun, exposure accelerated fluid loss. The need for water was constant and could not be postponed. Rain became the only reliable source. During intermittent storms, Alvarenga collected rainwater using available containers and surfaces. The interior of the boat, plastic equipment, and even clothing were used to gather and channel water into storage. There was no purification process required, but there was also no guarantee of frequency. Periods without rain extended for days, forcing careful rationing. Food followed a similar pattern of adaptation. Fishing, the original purpose of the trip, became a survival mechanism. Without nets or advanced tools, Alvarenga relied on hand lines when possible. Fish that came close to the boat were caught and consumed. In many cases, they were eaten raw. There was no means to cook. Preservation was not possible. Consumption was immediate. Birds became another source of food. Seabirds occasionally landed on the boat, often drawn by the presence of fish remains. When this occurred, Alvarenga captured them by hand. The process required patience and timing rather than force. Once caught, the birds were used for both meat and blood. Blood provided hydration when fresh water was unavailable, though its effectiveness was limited. Sea turtles were also encountered. When possible, turtles were pulled onto the boat. They provided a larger, more sustained food source. Their blood was used similarly to that of birds, offering temporary relief from dehydration. The shells and remains had no long-term utility beyond immediate consumption. These methods were not structured in the beginning. They developed through repetition. Each successful action reinforced its continuation. Over time, a pattern formed not of routine in the traditional sense, but of consistent response to need. Days were no longer measured by clocks or schedules. Time was tracked through environmental cycles. Sunrise and sunset marked intervals. Changes in the moon provided a rough indication of longer periods. However, without reference points, the distinction between one day and the next became less precise. Cordoba struggled with these conditions. His lack of experience at sea became more apparent as time progressed. Exposure to raw food, particularly uncooked fish and bird meat, led to physical discomfort. Reports indicate that he experienced nausea and difficulty maintaining intake. This reduced his ability to sustain energy levels. Hydration remained inconsistent. Periods without rain forced both men to rely on alternative sources, including animal blood and small amounts of retained moisture. These measures were not sufficient for long-term stability. Physical decline during these intervals was noticeable. Alvarenga adapted more effectively. His prior experience allowed him to accept conditions that were outside normal expectations. He maintained the process of catching food and collecting water with consistency. His actions were not improvised in the moment, but repeated as a system. This repetition reduced uncertainty. The boat itself required minimal intervention. There were no repairs that could restore propulsion. Structural maintenance was limited to clearing excess water and ensuring that weight remained balanced. The vessel's continued flotation depended largely on its initial construction and the absence of catastrophic damage during the storm. Sharks were occasionally visible. They followed the boat at a distance, attracted by discarded remains. Their presence did not result in direct interaction, but reinforced the isolation of the environment. There was no safe area beyond the boat itself. The water, though a source of food, remained a boundary. Sun exposure became a persistent factor. Without shelter, both men were exposed to direct sunlight for extended periods. Clothing provided limited protection. Skin damage accumulated gradually. There was no effective method to mitigate this beyond minor adjustments in position. Sleep occurred in short intervals. The boat's movement, combined with environmental exposure, prevented extended rest. Sleep was taken when possible, often without clear separation between day and night. Fatigue accumulated but did not stop necessary activity. Attempts at rescue were not coordinated. At the time of their disappearance, local awareness of their absence existed, but search efforts were limited in scope and duration. The Pacific, at that scale, does not allow for precise tracking of small vessels without consistent communication. Once contact was lost, the probability of locating the boat decreased rapidly. Drift continued. Ocean currents in the eastern Pacific move in patterns that can carry floating objects over large distances. Without control, the boat became part of this system. Its path was not linear. It shifted with changing conditions, moving gradually away from its origin. Cordoba's condition did not improve. His reduced intake of food and water weakened his physical state. He was less able to participate in the processes that sustained survival. This created an imbalance in effort, with Alvarenga assuming the majority of tasks. Communication between the two diminished. There are no verified records of detailed exchanges during this period. Observations suggest that Cordoba became increasingly withdrawn. His responses slowed. Activity decreased. The environment did not support recovery. Alvarenga continued the established system. He caught fish when possible. He collected rainwater when available. He adjusted to each change without deviation from the basic process. His actions remained consistent even as conditions fluctuated. The boat remained intact. It did not capsize. It did not break apart. It continued to drift, carrying both men across open water without interruption. There were no passing ships within visible range. No aircraft sightings were confirmed during this period. Time extended beyond initial expectation. What had begun as a single-day fishing trip had moved into weeks. The distinction between short-term survival and long-term endurance became irrelevant. There was no defined endpoint, only continuation. At sea, Survival does not rely on progress toward a destination. It depends on the ability to maintain function in the absence of one. For Alvarenga and Cordoba, that function held for a time, but it did not hold for both of them. As the drift continued, the imbalance between the two men became more pronounced. Ezequiel Cordoba had struggled from the early stages of survival, and over time, his condition worsened in ways that could not be reversed within the limits of their environment. His ability to eat remained inconsistent. Raw fish and bird meat, which had become essential sources of sustenance, were difficult for him to tolerate. Periods of refusal or inability to consume food reduced his physical strength. Without sufficient intake, recovery from dehydration and exposure became unlikely. Water remained irregular. Rainfall did not follow a predictable schedule. Intervals without precipitation extended for days. During these periods, both men relied on alternative sources, including small amounts of retained water and animal blood. These measures were insufficient to maintain stable hydration over time. Cordoba's activity declined. He spent longer periods inactive, lying within the limited space of the boat. His participation in essential tasks, catching food, collecting water, maintaining balance, became minimal. The burden of sustaining both individuals shifted almost entirely to José Salvador Alvarenga. There are no detailed records of Cordoba's final days. Accounts provided later by Alvarenga indicate that his companion's condition deteriorated steadily. Weakness increased. Movement became limited. At some point, he stopped responding altogether. The exact moment of death is not documented with precision. After Cordoba died, the situation changed in structure, though not in environment. Alvarenga was now alone on the vessel. The systems he had developed, catching fish, collecting rainwater, maintaining the boat, continued without interruption. The absence of a second person did not reduce the physical demands of survival. It removed shared presence. The body remained on the boat for a period of time. Alvarenga later reported that he kept it for several days before disposing of it in the ocean. This delay has been interpreted as a response to isolation, rather than a practical necessity. There were no established procedures for such circumstances. The decision was made without external reference. Following this, the environment returned to its previous state of continuity. The ocean did not change in response to the loss. Currents continued to carry the vessel. Weather patterns remained variable, but not extreme. The absence of Cordoba did not alter external conditions, only the internal reality of survival. Time became less defined. Without interaction, there were fewer markers to distinguish one day from another. Activities continued: catching, collecting, maintaining, but without shared observation. Their sequence became less structured. Memory of duration relied entirely on environmental cycles. Alvarenga maintained function. He continued to secure food when possible. He collected rainwater during storms. He adjusted to fluctuations in weather and availability without deviation from the established process. There is no indication of abandonment of these routines. Psychological strain was present but not fully documented. Extended isolation at sea is known to affect perception and cognition. However, specific details from this period are limited to retrospective accounts. What can be confirmed is that survival actions remained consistent. The boat continued to drift. With no change in direction or speed that could be measured, it moved across open water, carrying a single occupant. The distance from its point of origin increased beyond practical estimation. By this stage, the survival situation had entered a different phase. It was no longer a shared effort under strain. It was a solitary process sustained over time, without interruption and without clear endpoint. After months at sea, the pattern of drift continued without visible change. The boat remained intact. Its movement followed currents that carried it across the Pacific, gradually approaching regions far from its point of origin. There was no indication of proximity to land until it was already near. In late January 2014, the vessel reached the shoreline of Eben Atoll, part of the Marshall Islands. The atoll is remote, with a small population and limited infrastructure. Its position lies thousands of kilometers from the coast of Mexico. The boat came to rest near the shore. Alvarenga left the vessel and reached land without assistance. His physical condition reflected prolonged exposure, significant weight loss, sun damage, and general weakness. Despite this, he was able to move and communicate. Local residents encountered him shortly after his arrival. Initial observations confirmed that he had been at sea for an extended period. His account of drift, survival methods, and the loss of his companion was recorded in the days that followed. Authorities were notified, and verification processes began. Medical evaluation indicated that, while weakened, he was not in immediate critical condition. His survival over approximately 118 days at sea was considered unusual, but consistent with the details he provided regarding food and water sources. There was no rescue event in the conventional sense. No vessel located him at sea. No coordinated operation brought him back. His arrival was the result of drift alone, ending when the ocean carried the boat to land. After reaching shore, he was transported for further medical care and debriefing. His identity and origin were confirmed through official channels, linking him back to the fishing community from which he had departed. The drift had ended without transition. One environment stopped, another began. In the months following his arrival in the Marshall Islands, José Salvador Alvarenga underwent medical observation and a series of interviews intended to document the duration and conditions of his survival. His account was reviewed by journalists, maritime experts, and officials. Distances were calculated. Ocean current patterns were examined. The timeline, though extreme, aligned with known drift trajectories across the Pacific. The journey had covered an estimated distance of more than 10,000 kilometers. This figure was not measured directly but derived from the point of departure near Chiapas to the location of landfall. Variations in current and direction meant that the actual path was likely longer and less direct. Skepticism emerged in some early responses. Survival over such a duration, with minimal equipment and no navigation, challenged conventional expectations. However, further analysis of physical condition, combined with environmental data, supported the plausibility of the account. Similar, though shorter, drift incidents had been documented in maritime history. Alvarenga eventually returned to El Salvador. His reintegration into daily life followed a period of recovery. Public attention, though present, diminished over time. His experience became part of a documented record rather than an ongoing event. The death of Ezequiel Cordoba remained a central element of the account. There were no independent witnesses to confirm the details of his final days. What is known comes from a single source, shaped by memory under prolonged isolation. The ocean crossing did not produce a clear narrative of triumph. It demonstrated continuity under extreme conditions. Survival was maintained through repetition, adaptation, and the absence of interruption. There were no decisive moments that defined the outcome, only a sustained process that continued until land was reached. In historical terms, the event remains an outlier. It reflects the scale of the Pacific and the limited control small vessels have once detached from shore. It also illustrates how survival in certain conditions depends less on direction and more on persistence. The ocean does not record these events. It continues without reference to those who pass.